At the mini Macna Seahorse and Pipefish event, our special guest speaker, Dr. Sarah Foster, gave such a fantastic presentation about her research and work that we just had to share it. Thank you again so much, Sarah, for sharing with us today.
It's really great to be with you all today. I was so excited to get invited to speak with you about Project Seahorse and the work we're doing to save seahorses. Obviously, I can't cover everything. So I thought I would just talk to you a little bit about the seahorse trade, since you're all into it in one way or another. So I'm going to start a bit by explaining first why Project Seahorse uses seahorses to guide our conservation efforts. So many groups or organizations use charismatic species to provide a focus for raising attention or stimulating action or even funding for broader conservation issues. And the advice given to conservation groups is to pick charismatic mammals, so think the elephant, attractive birds such as the bald eagle, or to play to people's instinct to protect cute and cuddly, which is pandas. But let's face it, fish are not pandas. Indeed, some people think they're downright scary. And they're certainly often not perceived as wildlife at all, but rather food. And so it can be really hard to raise public awareness and interest in fish and fish conservation. All of you are very into fish, which is fantastic, but we're kind of a rare breed, those of us who love fish. But we think we found a fish that does the job quite well, which the panda of the underwater world, if you will. And that fish is the seahorse. So seahorses are iconic in the fish world. As you all know, they appeal to everyone. They may not be cuddly, but they definitely can be cute. And they're also just incredibly cool. They're the only animal in the world where the male gets pregnant, for starters. So they're just fascinating. And they're actually extraordinary fish that are deserving of our help in their own right. We don't really need to be coming up with lots of reasons, but the key driver for us is that in working to protect seahorses, we're actually supporting marine conservation more globally, as seahorses suffer the same pressures, but also therefore benefit from the same solutions as most other coastal marine life. So they're threatened by the same fishing practices and the same habitat degradation that's affecting most of our coastal ecosystems. So in working to save seahorses, we're actually also working to save the seas. So at Project Seahorse, we believe that the solutions in marine conservation are most effectively appreciated by considering the interdependencies between marine life and human communities. So our work is based on the idea of the world as an onion, conservation onion, with a hierarchy of concentric circles of pressure bearing down on the individual animals. We begin at the center with our research and action efforts at the level of the fish. And we work out through habitats and ecosystems, to the fishers, their communities and regions, to national and global governance issues, and public outreach. And without addressing all these layers of pressure bearing down on the fish, efforts focused only at the fish will not be successful. So today I'm going to talk to you more about our efforts at the national and global layers of the onion. But really the work I'm talking to you about hits all these layers. So again, you all know this, but one of the things that makes seahorses so incredible is their specialized life history. So as I said, only animal on the planet that we know of where the male gets pregnant. They form pair bonds and they have small broods. And this is aspects that make them quite vulnerable to heavy exploitation. But in spite of this, they are exploited globally in great numbers. Now, the greatest pressure on seahorses overall is from trawling and other non-selective gears that land seahorses as bycatch. So any one boat tends to catch just a few seahorses per day, but the cumulative total is large because our fishing effort is so big. So our latest review of seahorse bycatch revealed that on average, boats catch about 1 seahorse per night. So just one boat, 1 seahorse per night. And so it's not really unusual that when I speak to fisheries managers in countries, they say, well, our fishers say they don't catch that many seahorses. And at an individual level, you could see that. But the challenge is that there there is so much fishing pressure. There are so many fishing boats that this adds up to a lot. So after accounting for the fishing pressure across the 21 countries we sampled, we estimated that indeed 37 million seahorses per year are being landed, mostly as bycatch and mostly in trawl fisheries. And I actually since updated this global catch with more recent estimates. And the updated estimate now sits at 76 million seahorses in just these 21 best assessed countries. So small catches, but a big problem because we have so many fishing boats. So I refer to bottom trawling and bycatch a bunch in this talk, and I just wanted to take a quick moment to make sure we all know what I'm talking about. So I want you to close your eyes, imagine your favorite forest or park. We all probably have a favorite green space. And now imagine a bulldozer coming through this and taking out everything in its path, every bird, every bee, every butterfly, every tree, every flower, every blade of grass. You'd be outraged, but yet this happens all the time in the oceans. And this is trawling. This is what bottom trawling is. It's also called dragging, and it's one of the most common types of fishing gear used in the oceans today because it's incredibly efficient at catching things. Basically, big nets are dropped with heavy weights that gouge and scrape the bottom. They mow down seagrasses, corals, sponges, other habitats, and catch everything in their path willy-nilly, including thousands of different fish species, as well as our beloved seahorses. So there's a lot of issues with bottom trawls, and maybe we can talk about them another time, but I just wanted to kind of give you a picture of what I'm talking about when I talk about bottom trawling. Getting rid of bottom trawling really is the best thing that could happen for seahorses, but also our oceans writ large. And a lot of people outside fisheries don't really know about them or the havoc that they're wreaking on the oceans. So I just wanted to get a little more detailed about that. And I can obviously answer more questions at the end. Okay, back to trade. So most exploited seahorses, no matter how they're caught, whether they're targeted or bycatch, find their way into trade. There are two trades: dried for traditional medicines and curiosities, and live for the aquarium trade. The dried trade for traditional medicines is by far the largest. We estimate it's about 98% of the trade by volume, with traditional Chinese medicine consuming the vast majority of specimens. But there are certain populations that are mostly fished for public or private aquaria. So the live trade can be the main issue for some populations. Project Seahorse carried out extensive global trade surveys in 1995 and then again at the turn of the century. I like saying that, but really it's the year 2000. And they showed a really unsustainable trade. They showed us that ever more countries were trading ever more seahorses, and indeed the number of seahorses had doubled. There was also a geographic expansion. So by 2002, more than 24 million animals were estimated to be traded among at least 77 nations. The surveys also revealed that exploitation combined with degradation of habitats had led to severe population declines in many regions. And because of all this information, seahorses were added to what's called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, which thankfully has an acronym, CITES, because it's a really long name. For those of you not familiar with CITES, it's a multilateral environmental agreement, which basically exists to try and ensure that international trade in specimens of wild animals and plants does not threaten their survival. Today, it accords for varying degrees of protection to more than 37,000 species of animals and plants, so a lot. Some are fully protected, those are on Appendix I, but the vast majority of the species are actually, trade is allowed to continue, but it has to be regulated. Now, CITES membership, the member countries are called parties, so you might hear me use the word party, and I'm referring to countries, not what we all wish we could be doing after this. So CITES membership is now up to 182 countries plus the EU. So covers most of the planet. And it really provides, it's a framework for regulating international trade in listed species. But the parties or the countries, it's up to them how they want to implement it at a national level. So in November 2002, seahorses were added to what's Appendix II of the convention, which means trade can happen, but it has to be sustainable, legal, and monitored. And all seahorse species were added. So no matter how many new cool ones we discover over time, they're automatically covered under the convention. So just a little bit about me. When I tell people that I work for Project Seahorse, this is often their first idea of what I do. And I wish I got to do a lot more of this. I have had some pretty incredible experiences dealing with the fish underwater, but they're rare and far between. I have spent time in the past. I spent more time in the field, but I was mostly working on fishing boats. So I did my PhD trying to understand the impact of shrimp trawling, of bottom trawling on small fish caught in the bottom of the nets in the Gulf of California in Mexico. And so I lived for 6 months on that boat you see in the top left of the screen, me and about 10 Mexican fishermen. I didn't have much Spanish when I got on the boat. I was pretty fluent within a couple months. But whenever I would speak with colleagues at the university I was collaborating with, they told me I spoke Spanish like a Mexican fisherman, and I used a lot of words I shouldn't. So anyway, I probably need to relearn it. But you could see there at the bottom, there's a seahorse among the catch, and you can see the shrimp is bigger than the seahorse. So when people talk about, being selective for size, so sometimes you hear people say, oh, well, we can just, modify the net so that we only get the shrimp and we leave everything behind. Not going to happen, because most of what they're catching is the same size as the shrimp. So what do I do now? Mostly this. So now my job is mostly working with people in country to try and implement CITES for seahorses. And that involves a lot of workshops and meetings. I also attend all of the CITES meetings as a representative of the IUCN, so the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And that is as the member of the Seahorse Specialist Group. So, okay, so although CITES is about international trade, implementing CITES for seahorse is really about improving fisheries management. We can't escape this. And this is especially true for seahorses because we don't have the tight supply-demand relationship that we do for a lot of other species in trade. So if we stopped, for example, using rhino horn, then we would stop killing rhinos. But the problem with seahorses is because they're sourced as bycatch, they will still be caught even if they're not being used. And indeed, the fact they are used and traded internationally may actually be to their benefit. The CITES listing has put pressure on governments to pay attention to seahorses in a way that they wouldn't have necessarily before, and even open doors to conversations about seahorse conservation that wouldn't have happened before they were listed on CITES. So perhaps counterintuitively, the use of seahorses for traditional medicine may be actually what makes governments stand up and pay attention, leading to gains in the long term. So it's a bit of a different framing than with other things we hear about in trade. So what does it mean to implement CITES for seahorses, particularly for Appendix II species? Well, the key thing is that export requires a permit to be issued by a national authority. And there are 3 conditions that are supposed to be met. First, the export must not harm wild populations of seahorses. And this is called making a non-detriment finding, or NDF. And I will come back to this in a moment. Live seahorses have to be treated humanely when shipped between countries. And I'm not going to focus on this, but there are guidelines for transportation that CITES people are supposed to follow. Many of you might already know about this, including guidelines specific to fish. The third thing is that seahorses cannot be caught in a way that violated any national laws. So for example, if the seahorses were fished in a marine protected area, then you can't trade them with a permit. Implementing CITES also means addressing seahorses leaving the country without permits, and that is illegal trade. So I'm going to focus the rest of the talk on the need for non-detriment findings and illegal trade, as that's where we've been most focused. So making non-detriment findings can seem quite daunting to parties, to governments. And this is mostly because countries feel they don't know enough. They don't think they have enough information on seahorses in their waters. And they also consider these assessments need to be really complex and involve perfect data entering into a massive complex fisheries model. But in reality, they don't have to be like that. And a lot of them can get going with what they already know, refining as information comes in. So making non-detriment findings really comes down to knowing 4 things. One is, where are the seahorses? The second is, what threats do they face? What management is in place to mitigate those threats? And is that management working? So where are the seahorses? We need some understanding of their distribution in space. What threats do they face? And it's important to consider all the threats because, for example, even a very small trade could be a problem where all the seahorse habitats are being turned into hotels. The management has to be relevant to the threat. Like, is it actually, you know, sometimes people say, oh, well, we have this in place, like a minimum size limit. But if they're all being caught as bycatch and shrimp trawls, then the minimum size limit's not going to be effective. And then, is the management working? So is there enough, and is it the right management after all? And in order to understand that, you need to monitor population trends. So there's a lot of ways to evaluate these 4 things. They range from simple to complex. So you could do really time-intensive and expensive underwater surveys to find all the seahorses underwater, or you could turn to citizen science efforts to help us understand distribution. Fishers are great they know the most about the seahorses because they interact with them the most. So we get most of our information on distribution of species, but also threats directly from fishers. And a lot of the information has already been collated in various assessments. So our efforts to support parties have been global. We've generated critical information on distribution, threats, management, and trends in most of the key seahorse trading countries around the world. And most countries know enough now to get started on making non-detriment findings for their seahorses, but we know that in fact, most are not doing that. And instead, what has happened over time is that most major seahorse exporters, for various reasons, have stopped issuing trade for their exports. Now, there's a lot of different reasons this has happened for different countries, and I won't get into all the details right now. Again, happy to dig into this later. But in general, it's either because they can't or they don't want to make defensible NDFs for their seahorses. So what does this mean? Well, it means most countries that reported trade before have stopped reporting that trade. So this graph shows the proportion of total trade reported to CITES. Countries have to actually tell CITES every year how much of all the different listed species they've traded. And 97 countries together made up 97% of the reported trade, with just 3% coming from other countries. And actually all 7 of those have now stopped issuing permits for their trade. We see this in the trade reported to CITES over time. So we see a steep decline in reported exports since 2011, when countries first started putting these restrictions in place. And we now see very little trade reported to CITES. Now, most of this volume is dry trade. I want you to realize that. So the light gray is dry trade and the little black bars are the live trade. So let's dig into the live trade a bit more closely because that's what probably really interests you. So for live trade, we also see a decline in reported volumes over time. They peaked at about 180,000 live seahorses being traded among countries in 2007. The other shift, but then there's been a real decline to about 20,000 more recently to be reported moving around the world. The other pattern we see here that's really interesting is a shift from wild sourcing. So the orange are wild sourced animals to captive bred. So there's 2 types of captive breeding recorded in CITES data. Those that are young born to wild caught parents. So this is called captive born. These are the gray bars. And then there's the truly closed life cycle, what we would call captive bred, which is the yellow bars. And so we see that over time, the orange bars, the wild, has declined a lot and been replaced by gray, quite a bit of gray, and then a smaller amount of truly captive bred seahorses. Now, globally, Sri Lanka is the main source of the captive bred, so the yellow, whereas Vietnam has always been the main reported source of the gray, which has been hippocampus, comas, and kuda. And Vietnam in 2016 is one of the parties that said it wouldn't export anymore. And we see that that gray really has dropped off. So we can dig into this a bit more for the US. And so this is the CITES data where the US has been reported as the importer of the live seahorses. And we see more or less the same pattern as the global trade, which is not surprising as the US is 1/3 to about 1/2 of the live trade in seahorses by volume. So we see quite a lot of wild animals being sent to the US in the early days, but then it was replaced by the gray, the captive born, or the captive, now more recently, the captive bred. Okay, back to global trade. So one thing that Project Seahorse has done for the dried trade, so I'm talking about the dried trade right now, is to see, do these CITES data reflect what is happening on the ground? Has the trade really almost stopped? Or is it going on, but outside CITES processes? And that brings us to the issue of illegal trade. So as I showed you, a lot of the permitted exporters of dried seahorses, the permitted export has dropped significantly, but the seahorses are still being caught. Their demand for traditional medicine remains, and dried seahorses are really easy to hide and move across borders. So there's a strong likelihood that the dried trade has continued. And we have comprehensive evidence for this from many countries, but this is just one example. So in 2019, we went to Hong Kong and we asked over 200 traders where they got their dried seahorses from. And Hong Kong is the world's major entrepot for trade in dried seahorses. And the graph shows the frequency by which different countries were reported as recent sources. And all you need to take away from this is all the countries with a red star should not be exporting seahorses. So this now a focus on CITES implementation for dried trade has become a focus on illegal trade. And this seems like a bigger problem, but really the solution to illegal trade is what we've been asking for all along, which is better fisheries management. Seahorses don't really care whether they enter a legal or illegal trade pattern. What they care is they came out of the water. And so that's really a fisheries issue. So where do we go from here? And these are just my last few slides. So the solution for dry trade really is we need to end bottom trawling. As I mentioned, bottom trawling is a huge problem for seahorses, but it's actually a really big problem for the oceans overall. There's no place in a blue economy, which is the buzzword right now, for bottom trawling. It's waste of life. Believe it or not, in most countries, the only reason they continue to operate is because taxpayer money is being used to keep them afloat. They're often involved in illegal fishing and certainly not well regulated in a lot of the world. And so we need to get them out of the water, and that is really going to make a big difference. So Project Seahorse is about to really embark on a big push to try and make this happen. We haven't done the same exercise with live trade to understand how the patterns in CITES data reflect on the ground, but we do know it's a lot harder to smuggle live seahorses. And so, the dried ones can be easily moved undetected across borders, but live ones need to go through specific ports, airports usually, and those are quite well managed even in most countries. But nevertheless, there's some wild trade, and we know more countries are talking about wanting to do either community-based fisheries for the live trade or get some seahorse culture going. So for wild trade, it's all about sustainable fisheries management. That's a lot easier for the target fisheries that tend to supply the live trade because you can actually put minimum size limits in place or use quotas. So it's easier to manage than a non-selective bycatch fishery. If they're captive born, then we need to make sure the wild caught parents are being taken sustainably. And captive bred, basically, we have to manage reliance on the wild brood stock, but that can be really minimal and well managed. Now, these, of course, are environmental challenges. I'm not going to get into social and economic sustainability because that's another talk for another time, but that's where we are. And just one last, oh, no, it's not wanting to move. There we go. One last slide. We often hear people talk about releasing seahorses as a conservation and management tool. And it's really important that is not automatically assumed to be the case. It's rarely done in a way that would make that true. Most of the places especially in Asia, they just kind of breed a bunch of seahorses and release them out into the wild, and then they probably get trawled up like 5 minutes later. So there are best practice guidelines I just like to make people aware of for when you're considering releases as a management tool or a conservation tool. And these really must be followed if releases are going to equal conservation. So I'm going to stop there. I hope I didn't go too much over time. And I am really, happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you again, Sarah, for joining us and sharing so much valuable information. And thank you to everyone who joined us for the Seahorse and Pipefish event at Mini Macna. For anyone who missed the event, we did further the discussion on Wine Wednesday. Find the link to that in the description, and be sure to join us for the next Seahorse and Pipefish event at Macna.